Get started? Sure, absolutely. This wasn't that what this wasn't a break. This next one's go. We're going to get started, folks. Thank you so much. Thanks, Amanda, so much for making this all a reality today. Amanda's a Kennedy, New York native. I mean, one of our folks. Go Faulkner. Yeah, exactly. So she came down from the big city to be part of this today. And coming in late last night from Detroit, the Motor City, Heather Ann Thompson, Dr. Heather Ann Thompson, University of Michigan, Seagulls, there you go. We can talk about that here in a second. She made the incredible effort to fly out of Detroit into Buffalo, rent a car, get here about 1 o'clock probably this morning, and then to get here this morning. In fact, you were earlier than we thought because Lee and Gary Lofert from the FBI were all down in our green room saying, "Where is she? Where is she?" And here she is, taking notes on Amanda's presentation. So thank you. Her resume is a mile long. She began her career at the faculty at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte from 1997 to 2009. Joined the faculty of Temple University in Philadelphia 2009 until 2015. Then she accepted a faculty position at the University of Michigan, go Blue, and where she has written about history and current crises of mass incarceration, and has been all over every program humanly possible, in Washington Post, NBC, PBS, NPR, Sirius Radio, but most importantly, she received a Pulitzer Prize in history for her work, Blood in the Water, the Attica prison uprisings of 1971 and its legacy. And I'm pleased to say I think this is the first time we've had a Pulitzer Prize winning author on a subject here at the Jackson Center and on such a timely subject. And I'm thrilled that all of us have the opportunity to listen to her. So without further ado, Dr. Thompson.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. And yes, I apologize if I'm a little hoarse and a little dark circles today because I have truly been on the road quite a bit. But I have to say I am so glad to be back here in New York because this is where the work that I spent so long working on probably resonates most. And as far as I can tell, I've never met a New Yorker that had not at least heard of Attica in some capacity, which is not always the case if I'm, giving a talk in Texas or Louisiana. So that makes it very special to be here. So thank you to the Jackson Center. Thank you so much, Greg, all of you for patiently sitting here listening to another presentation. And I want to say that it's very meaningful for me to share this story about Attica with you today for many reasons, not the least of which is today is the anniversary of the very traumatic end to that prisoner rights protest. And it's also deeply meaning because in the last several weeks there have been prison protests across this country really in the name of Attica, but also indicative of how we have really done far too little to remedy the things that led to Attica in the first place. And I know that so many of you here are law professors or practitioners of the law, and I think as we go through the presentation, it will become clear to you why, as I say when I give this talk in law schools all the time, this story is really, really central to any understanding of American legal history. and certainly resonates today as we still are litigating the question of prisoner rights. And so to begin the talk, I'm actually, before I'll even talk about Attica, I just kind of want to set the stage for it, again, reiterating why I think it's important for us to know about it. And even though I'm a historian, I write very much with the eye towards understanding where we are today. I love history for history's sake, but I also am deeply aware that the past matters to decisions that we made and how we ended up where we are. And so in this particular context, when I say where we are, it's not a great place. There's many wonderful things about where we are, but when it comes to the area of criminal justice, we are in a deeply alarming place, I would argue. We have, as you can see by some of this data, we have more than 2 million people that are confined to, almost 2,000 facilities across this country that include jails and military prisons and civil commitment centers, and you could just go on and on. And we have about 7 million people living under some form of correctional control. So that could be probation, it could be parole. And if you think about what this has meant over time, it means that we have, and these estimates vary, some say as high as 100 million Americans that live with a criminal record. And for those of us in the legal profession, we know that that has enormous ramifications for everything from how much income you'll have to your ability to keep your children, to a number of factors. Many of the people I'm talking about who are locked up are in fact children themselves, and many of them are locked up for offenses that would never land an adult in jail. And so this has kind of crowded our system in such an extraordinary fashion that we have become really a quite severe international outlier. On this graph, you see our incarceration rate compared to many countries, but there's some that are not on here. And I just want to assure you that it wouldn't matter which country we put on this map. China, Rwanda, the Netherlands, it doesn't matter what's on here. We are a dramatic international outlier. And that's important because it's not just that we're an international outlier and that we have so many people in prison. One of the privileges I have of being a historian is that I get to piece back in time what got us here, why we did this. And one of the most startling things that scholars now understand is that we didn't have to do this. That whereas popular belief is that we made this turn because of a massive crime spree, in fact, we laid the groundwork for this and began the war on crime before there was a massive uptick in crime. And we actually began the war on crime in '65 with Johnson, not with Nixon. And when we look at the data, it's pretty startling. I just go straight to homicide because I figure we can all agree that someone's either dead or they're not. And we see that, in fact, the homicide rate had not been that low since the teens, when we actually began to invest most resources into a robust criminal justice system. And the other thing that the data now shows, which is quite startling, is that the violent crime rate, and very specifically violence, goes up exponentially the deeper we get into the war on crime. And so one of the things that we will, what we are, is completely counterintuitive, is that as the incarceration rate goes up, the crime rate actually fluctuates, but the violence rate goes up in concert with the incarceration rate. And so that's one of the reasons why this is worth looking at. And one of the conclusions that the data leads to is that we didn't do this for a crime reason initially, but we certainly did it as a result of political pressure. And in fact, every major uptick since 1972 in this incarceration rate is the fallout from a pretty serious major shift in political policy, as you can see from this graph. And this is only a smattering of what those things were. It is bipartisan. We can't lay this at the feet of any one party. The Democrats, the Republicans, everybody was knee-deep in this project, and so here we sit. We know that this is an incarceration that is deeply, deeply racially disparate. And if we doubt how disparate it is, how disproportionately people of color are locked in this system, I just invite you to the graph on the bottom right, which compares us to South Africa at the height of apartheid. Not company that we would normally want to be kept with. And so at this point, in many of the talks that I do, I just do have to take a moment to say that there is a tendency, I think, particularly on the part of much of the voting population, when they see this disproportionality, to say, or at least think secretly, well, is that because people of color commit more crimes, right? Is this where the drugs are being dealt? Is this where the drug use is taking place, and so forth? And all I can say is just a striking no to that. And as we know, drug offenses account for most of our incarcerated population. And I just, if you can just see, this is one graph of hundreds I could have chosen. And by the way, my white college students are well aware of this, which is that white folks use more drugs and sell more drugs than any other racial group. And so this is a really interesting way of kind of debunking why we're here. So then we have a lot of pressure on us to figure, or what it means to be here. We have a lot of pressure on us to talk about how we got here. Just on this question of disproportionality, I love to share this slide, particularly because if we're just talking about basic marijuana consumption, something that's now legal in many states, look at the disproportionality of the arrest rates for marijuana. Based on race. This is the major counties, this is LA County, Cook County, Wayne County, where I'm from, and it's staggeringly disproportionate who actually ends up getting arrested for marijuana. And so again, why explain all this? It is to say that when you create a system that is bigger than any other on the planet and larger than at any other time in American history, we as historians certainly, but I would suggest as citizens, have a big burden to explain why. Why did we do this? How did we end up here? And how did we end up in a situation now where both Democrats and Republicans are kind of scratching their head trying to figure it out, how to fix it? And how did we end up in a situation that here it is, 47 years after Attica, and prisoners across the nation are telling us these places are in a serious crisis, that folks need help. By the way, literally as we speak right now, in South Carolina, prisoners are not being evacuated from low-level lying prisons, so they're still locked in their cells. And incidentally, I'll just quickly finish that little prologue by saying, and it doesn't work. The system doesn't work. I mean, it'd be one thing if we invested all these resources and we still felt like it worked, but we know that based on the recidivism rate, which is about 80%, that by its own metric, these are failing institutions. And I always use the example of public schools. If a public school system had an 80% failure rate, that is to say 80% of its students never graduated, we would shut it down, right? We would think about how to do it differently. Okay, so what happened at Attica, I want to suggest to you, has everything to do, not only to do, but a lot to do with why we ended up where we are today. And I want to suggest that it's actually because we got this story so wrong, we meaning the American population in general, that we took a pretty serious punitive turn that we are still kind of reeling from. And this is really a moment for us to look back on what actually happened and what the consequences were of not telling history as it actually happened. Attica, if I could blow this thing up for you in a little bit more detail, happens in 1971. And as you see, the incarceration rate takes this dramatic jump up. You can see here kind of, end of the 70s, or end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. But if we were to really zero in on this, you would see that the most dramatically straight upward track happens after 1972. And this has a very interesting relationship to the story I'm going to tell you. Okay, so all of that, we're now hopefully oriented. I'm going to tell you about Attica. So this is the book that I wrote. It's called Blood in the Water. And if you haven't seen the book, it's a bit of a doorstop, right? It's quite large, and there it is. You can use that to prop up your house if there's ever a storm. But the thing about the book is, it took me 13 years to write this book. And when I was on the Daily Show, Trevor Noah said, "Is that because you type like this?" It's like, no, that's not why it took so long. It's because, frankly, the state of New York made access to public records extremely difficult. And even to this day, many records are shut to the public, or at least made most difficult to get on behalf of the public. And so what that meant was trying to piece together the story upside down, sideways, underneath. And it also was only made possible by actually a complete accident. I happened upon some critically important records that allowed me to tell the story of what had really happened at Attica, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. There are some humorous elements of what is otherwise not a very humorous story. The research, so I just told you about that. By the way, why is all of this off limits? Well, let's be clear. In the state of New York, there is no statute of limitations on murder. And part of the story of Attica is a story of murder. And so there has been a lot of folks very invested in making sure that we just let this thing lie. Nobody really wants to open up the questions that really lie at the heart of this story. It's the story. Well, for those of you in New York, I don't have to tell you much about Attica in terms of what it is or where it is, but just to refresh, this is a tiny town in upstate New York. This is a town that certainly in 1971 was overwhelmingly white, still is, but just outside of this tiny town, beautiful, just outside the small park with the bandstand and the Little League Park, lies this fortress, this massive maximum security facility that was built during the Great Depression. And I have to tell you that in 1971, it looked exactly as it did in 1932. And when I was there inside in 2004, it looked exactly as it did in 1932. And if you were to go in there today, because it is still a maximum security facility, it looks today exactly as it did. It is foreboding. It is these ancient locking mechanisms. And when I was there in 2004 up on the catwalks, the cement is still chipped from the bullets that flew during the retaking of Attica. So this is a very important symbolic institution in the state as well. So in 1971, this place was filled to the brim, about 2,400 men, overwhelmingly from downstate, from New York City, from the Bronx, from Queens, who had come up to this maximum security facility. By the way, again, overwhelmingly African-American men, Puerto Rican men, although a lot of white men as well. And they had come up to this facility for sometimes violent crimes, but to a very surprising degree for low-level crimes. And indeed, there were a lot of parole violators inside of this facility, young kids, 19 years old, 20 years old. One of the most central figures in Attica from upstate New York was there for driving without a driver's license. These 2,400 men are guarded by a force of young white men who, good-hearted young kids from upstate New York who simply wanted to make a living, and prisons were the way that you do that, particularly with no other real industry or jobs in town. Both groups had some folks who'd gone to Vietnam. Both groups had some who were very traumatized from that experience. And both groups shared one thing very powerfully in common, which was the knowledge that this place was a tinderbox, that there were terrible things going on in there that could be remedied quite easily by some basic injection of human rights. So For the men inside, these are guys being fed on 63 cents a day. These are men who did way too much time in their cell, not enough rec time. These are guys subjected to very capricious parole rules, like you could get parole, but then you'd be handed this out-of-date phone book and sort of told that you can't leave unless you have a job, and the only way you can get a job is to write to an employer. And which of course requires stamps and letters and paper, or paper to write the letter. And needless to say, not too many local employers or even employers in New York City were that keen on hiring somebody whose postmark was Attica, New York, and they had a number. And so these were the conditions that really ground people down. If you were a Spanish-speaking prisoner, and there were many, but no Spanish-speaking guards, you couldn't get mail from your family members because if it was in Spanish, it would just go in the trash. If you were not married to the mother of your children, you couldn't see your children. I mean, it was just kind of the indignities go on, but nobody in there was asking to get out. They were asking for basic nutrition, basic medical care. The medical care was shockingly bad. People died, people lost, limbs. I mean, we could just go on and on. The guards knew this, and the guards, many of them were quite sympathetic to it. And in fact, they too had their own complaints. This place was too overcrowded. It wasn't safe for them. You had one guy who would run a company of 80 prisoners to mess hall with a nightstick. And, overwhelmed by the sheer presence of how many people there were in there. There wasn't enough staff, there wasn't enough training, and so these guys are also complaining. They're going to their union meetings and they're saying, do something. The guys inside are writing letters to their state senator, to the commissioner of corrections, to whoever will listen and saying, do something. And the thing that was kind of powerful about this moment, which is leading up to the rebellion, is that both groups have this faith in the system, right? The demands are basic. They're not crazy. We're not asking for anything outlandish here, but try to fix this thing because we can't continue like this. Well, needless to say, nobody really listens. And on September 9th, 1971, 47 years ago this week, there was an utter explosion in this facility. And this was on the heels of other explosions in other New York State prisons, namely Auburn, that had happened the November before. And the issues were the same. Basically, frustration boiling over. Wasn't planned. In fact, in this case, the reason why it actually happens is due to these prison management decisions to lock these guys in this hall, prisoners and guards alike, not telling anybody what's going on. Panic ensues. Everyone thinks there's going to be a conflict. They're backing away from each other, grabbing anything they can to protect themselves. And in that melee, a faulty gate comes open, which then is the floodgates. And everyone's running, and people are taking out their frustrations on each other. It's dangerous. People are getting hurt. People are hiding. Some people are locking themselves in cells because they're so afraid. In the middle of the prison, there's this one young man, William Quinn, who's trying his best to keep the doors all shut and make sure this thing can trying to call for help, but the phones are all jammed because they're so archaic they don't work. And he gets completely overridden, beaten very badly, and we'll hear more about him in a moment. But what then happens is historic. Calmer heads prevail, and some of the kind of internal leadership in the prison, they had crossed political lines, crossed racial lines to stand together. Thank you. They decided that we have to bring some order to this. So they moved the men out to one of the 4 exercise yards called D Yard. And to the extent that there were people who had grabbed hostages, and there were about 40 civilian and guard hostages, they were all corralled in this one area, surrounded by 2 rings of prisoners to make sure that they would not be further harmed. And there was an acute understanding that if this was going to be in a moment where we could actually bring attention to conditions in prison, the hostages had to be protected, because that would be the only thing standing between these prisoners and the state of New York coming in with force. And so thus begins one of the most kind of remarkable protests in U.S. history, remarkable on a number of counts. For starters, these guys set up really a tent city. They set up a medical station, a food distribution station. They have everyone out in the yard so that everyone's out in the open so that they can have the safety in numbers. They make sure that the hostages have the mattresses out of the cells to sleep on. They elect representatives to speak for them out of all of the cell blocks. And they immediately want the media there because they know the same thing that prisoners know today, which is that it is the lack of transparency that allows all unimaginable, terrible things to go on behind bars, right? I mean, imagine if prisons were these translucent cubes in the middle of the town square where everyone could see every day what was happening in them, right? Well, they're the opposite of that. And they knew that. So they wanted the media there. They wanted observers there to oversee any negotiations they might have with the state of New York because they didn't trust state actors. And they, again, wanted the public to know what are the issues, so that they couldn't imagine them to be something different. And hopefully to change conditions inside of Attica and hopefully to set the standard for more improved conditions. So these observers that they asked to come in were a real star-studded cast of New York. The prisoners wanted certain people whom they knew had gone on the record in support of prisoner rights. So in this picture, you'll see Tom Wicker, the famous columnist from the New York Times. He had written favorably about the need for human rights in prison. In the middle is the sort of firebrand William Kunstler, a civil rights lawyer who at this time was known to all prisoners as someone who had defended the Chicago 7 and Bobby Seale and people like that. And on the right, or I'm sorry, on your left is Clarence Jones, who was the editor of the Amsterdam News in Harlem, and it was very important because he printed prisoner letters from the inside, so they're trying to tell their story. But this group that they wanted was augmented by the group that the state of New York wanted. So there were also Republican state senators on there. There was a U.S. congressman on there, Herman Badillo. This was a real range of political points of view and various community organization representatives, and they're all this kind of unwieldy group of about 40, almost 40 observers. And for the next 4 days and nights, this group negotiates, the prisoners negotiate with state officials around the clock. And in the book, you're there with them in D-Yard. You can see this picture on the top left. I just want to call your attention to it. It's really an extraordinary scene. One that was not completely unprecedented because something similar had played out in New York City in 1970, where Mayor Lindsay had gone to negotiate with prisoners for a similar situation in the Tombs. But over here you see the Commissioner of Corrections, Russell Oswald, who was a liberal reformer himself. He's trying to negotiate with the prisoners. You can see there's a negotiating table. Everything that went on in that table was being translated into Spanish so that everyone who spoke Spanish could understand what was going on. All major decisions were being voted on. And I want to just call your attention to two figures here on the top right. One, the tall, skinny kid, that is L.D. Barkley from Rochester, New York. He was the one that was there on a parole violation. He was driving without a driver's license. And he became kind of like what they called Attica brother number one. He was very fiery in his oration about the need for prisoner rights. And to his right, with the sunglasses, was a man named Frank Smith. He went, everyone knew him by the name Big Black, and he was in charge of security in the yard because he'd been the football captain prior to that. And I just call your attention to these two men because you'll hear more about them. These negotiations are quite extraordinary. What do they want? Well, it takes a while to figure out what they want because it's a democratic process, and some people want some outlandish things, and most people want basic human rights. And so when the voting process is all done, these are things like better medical care. These are things like a balanced, nutritious diet. These are things like reform to the rules of parole, Spanish-speaking guards, kind of, again, these kind of basic demands. And incredibly, in this negotiation process, they had come to an accord on almost all of them with the state officials. And, we now know that some of the documents that I found, made clear that, I'm not sure that that was fully in good faith, in the sense that, Commissioner Oswald knew that the language with which he was agreeing, would maybe make them a little bit easy to get out of later, but nevertheless, it felt good. It felt like there was some real progress being made. In the middle of this, though, the guard who I described to you in the very beginning, and that chaos that was the riot, the complete violent chaos, Billy Quinn, dies of the injuries that he sustained. And the prisoners had gotten him out of they'd taken him out on a mattress to get him medical care, but he lay on that mattress for a very long time. He was beaten very badly. He ended up dying. When that happens, this is a game changer. Because the men inside understand that when he died, that meant that all of them could be on the hook for felony murder, number one. And number two, they were terrified of the reprisals that could be rained down on them as a result of the death of this guard. Now, they had already been saying that they needed to have amnesty in order to surrender, and what they meant by that was no indiscriminate prosecutions, but mostly what most of them meant by that was the protection from any members of law enforcement should they surrender. They were literally terrified to surrender because of what had happened in other prison uprisings. The thing was that the amnesty issue was going to be the sticking point. The governor of New York, who was Nelson Rockefeller, was not going to budge. Why did this matter? Because this is what was going on outside of the prison during those same 4 days and 4 nights. Every state trooper battalion in New York descended on Attica in that same 4 days. Corrections officers from all the other prisons came to Attica. And in that same 4 days that the negotiations are going on, these guys are getting angrier and angrier, understandably. There's rumor mongering going on. One of the troopers actually has a brother who's a hostage inside. But it's also true that they've had no sleep. They've had no training for a riot situation like this. And they are passing out weapons indiscriminately. And in fact, they're handing out weapons. Nobody's writing down the serial numbers. Nobody is associating the weapon with the trooper. And in fact, one hapless young trooper who's trying to do so is told to rip it up. And this is what the observers see. And they know that this is a disaster waiting to happen. And by the way, Rockefeller had his guys on the scene too, so they also could see the same thing. So they beg Rockefeller to, if you cannot give amnesty, can you please just come to the prison? You don't have to meet with the prisoners, but can you stand outside and endorse the 28 demands we've all agreed upon? Can you assure them that if they surrender, they will not be harmed? And that while there will be prosecutions, there will not be indiscriminate prosecutions, right? That there will be a very targeted investigation of the death of William Quinn. And he says no. And so State Senator John Dunn and Tom Wicker call him at his home. He's up in Peconico Hills. He's on his estate, and they beg him, please, Mr. Governor, you have to come. It's not unprecedented. John Lindsay negotiated inside with the prisoners to great end in downstate. We need you here. And why do we need you here? Because we have 40 of your state employees in there. Like, even if you don't even care about the prisoners, we've got to end this thing peacefully. And he says no. So then they issue a public statement because they're really hoping that the public will now weigh in. And if you notice in their public statement, they don't mince words, right? Nobody's under the illusion about what's going to happen here. They use the word massacre. They say, please get the governor to come. And again, why? Because this is what they are witnessing outside of their windows. They are seeing this passing out of guns. They are seeing the fury. Let's remember that none of the prisoners have guns and none of the guards have guns on the inside. So now it is the 5th morning, and it is cold and rainy, and it's September in upstate New York, which for some reason right now is incredibly warm, but was not in 1971. And there is a sense that this thing can end, it will end, but we've got to keep on negotiating. Well, what the prisoners did not know was that the governor had already decided that this was not going to end with a negotiation. It was going to end with physical force. And the whole debate about how to end this, or when it ended, or when did it become inevitable that they had to go in, was really a central question in my book, because state officials had always said they had to go in on that 5th day. They had warned them, then they went in. But now we know that, in fact, the only thing that had stopped them going in earlier was a really extraordinary Republican state senator by the name of John Dunn, who kept kind of trying to persuade them to keep on negotiating and not go in. And we know that on the day that they are going to decide to go in, and this is a key document I found, they deliberately did not give these guys an ultimatum. In fact, they were told not to give these guys an ultimatum. And why is that important? Because on that 5th morning in D-Yard, when state officials come to the gate and say the same thing that they had said every single morning, which is, surrender the hostages, we're done, today is the day, we're over, you know, exact same language. Again, careful not to use an ultimatum of what would happen if they did not. The guys inside think negotiations are still going on. They think it's a morning much like any other. And so on that morning, when they suddenly hear the sound of a helicopter revving up, for many of them, and this is sort of heartbreaking when you think about it, they actually think Rockefeller's coming. And a cheer kind of goes up in the yard because they think, oh God, you know, finally we can end this. Because remember, they want to end this too. But they want to end it and keep their lives and not all face the death penalty, or the potential of a returning death penalty. So they hear this. The thing was, though, again, the more sage minds in the yard kind of start paying attention, and they realize the observers haven't been down, and it feels eerily quiet, and the troopers that had been up on the catwalks with, you know, watching this whole thing, somehow it's, you know, everyone's kind of fading away, like something terrible is about to happen. And at that moment, they make a very ill-fated decision to implement their last-ditched effort to stop what they think is going to be their last-ditch effort to stop the state of New York from coming in. And that is something that they had talked about, they had planned, they had actually, the hostages were aware of this plan, although they were deeply nervous of the prisoners' intentions, and also by now really worried that their bodies might not in fact have much value. They decide that they're going to take the hostages, at least some of them, up on the catwalks that oversit these yards. Now, again, right before this, the day before, and again, in this effort to keep negotiations going, the prisoners invite the media in, and the media is interviewing these hostages. And to a one, they're saying, we are being treated well, you know, these guys want basic things, do what they need, you know, Mr. Governor, please come to Attica. And so everyone's seen them on tape. Everyone knows what's going on. The cameras are running. So despite the rumors of, you know, inmate atrocities going on against guards, you know, they could see that they were alive. But on this morning, when they decide to take them up there, the plan seems simple, but it is not going to prove very smart. They put a couple of prisoners around each of the guards, and they are going to be the so-called executioners. And I say so-called because that's actually the term they used. So the idea was this: we were going to surround a hostage, and if that helicopter comes back, right, if they're going to come in here, and by the way, they thought if they did come in, they'd come in with billy clubs, as had always happened in any other circumstance in a prison riot. Let them know you can't come in here, because if you do, the only lives you're jeopardizing are your own state employees, right? We're going to kill them if you come in. And I take you in this moment up on the catwalk, for example. And this is the story that I'm telling you in the book is like, I mean, it's really, you feel, I think, that you're there in that moment. I hope you feel like you're there in that moment, one of my reviewers. But in that moment, for example, up on one of the catwalks was a young guard by the name of Mike Smith, very young, in his 20s, and he's standing up there, and next to him is a young prisoner by the name of Don Noble, and they knew each other. They had worked together in the Attica metal shop. And Mike was very liked by the prisoners because before any of this happened, they had tried to write letters. Remember I told you to just do something? And Mike said, yeah, I think that's a good idea. Makes sense, You're not asking anything crazy. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So he was seen as a supporter. Don and he had become sort of friends in their relationship in the yard. And they are both up there and they are terrified. They are sick to their stomach. They are terrified because neither one of them at this moment has any faith, frankly, that hostage lives are going to matter enough to stop what is inevitably going to be a horrific, horrific confrontation. And so they're up there, and, I take you into that moment where they're talking with one another, and, Mike is saying to Don, look, in my back pocket, I have a small note I managed to write, and it's to my wife, and her name is Sharon, and if I don't get out of here, can you please give her this note and tell her that I love her? And Don is also exchanging his particulars, and and then next to them is another young man, Ron Kozlowski, who has got a terrified prisoner next to him, and he's so sick, like he feels like he's going to literally vomit because he's so nervous, and and the guy's saying next to him, don't. I'm not going to hurt you, boss. I'm not going to hurt you, but we got to stop these guys from getting in. But of course, he's not sure he's not going to hurt him, and he's terrified, right? And right at that moment, another massive helicopter comes over D Yard, and as Mike described it, the young guard, Mike Smith, described it, he said, it was so large and so loud, he says, you could just feel the concussion in your chest right above your head. And right in that moment, the helicopter comes over, and it drops these canisters of CN and CS gas all over the yard. And, it's tear gas, but unless you've ever experienced it, what is hard to explain is that gas is kind of a misnomer, right? It is actually a powder, and it diffuses in the air like a gas, but what it does is it clings to your mucous membrane, so it goes down your throat and in your eyes and up your nose. And so when this gas comes over, and you can see exactly what happened because the state troopers are filming all of this, the gas mows everybody down, quite literally. And when they are vomiting and teary, they're blinded, they're on the ground, crawling around, that is when hundreds of state troopers go into the prison. And if you question how thick this gas was, look at it. They have gas masks on. You can barely see, but nobody that's in there without the gas mask can see. And they start shooting. And for 15 minutes, all you can hear, and again, this is very interesting because there is tape of this. There's visual tape, and then all of a sudden there's tape, but you can't see anything, but all you can hear is two things. One, the sound of another helicopter, the first one circling overhead and intoning again and again and again, surrender with your hands up and you won't be harmed. Surrender with your hands up and you won't be harmed, to the sound of da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Needless to say, it was a bloodbath. 128 men were shot, some of them 6, 7, 8 bullets, so severely wounded they could not possibly walk, were unlikely to survive. 39 men did not survive, prisoners and hostages alike. And I'm going to put a pause here. I'll come back to this, because at that moment, the American public hear a completely different story about what just happened. And let me just pause and tell you something about the American public. This is 1971. And if you look at polling data from 1971, most Americans were against the death penalty. Most Americans polled believed that prisoners did deserve basic human rights. Most Americans polled felt that prisons were these warehousing institutions and that we needed to rethink them and that we needed to start thinking more about community corrections, that we needed to think about today, to use a word we would use today, decarceration. But in this moment, those people who had been watching this avidly, and they'd been reading the New York Times and reading the LA Times, and they'd been reading this story and watching it on the nightly news every night, are told, right outside of this prison, that the prisoners are the ones who've killed the hostages. They've slit their throats. They are animals. They are barbarians. And worse than even probably the throat slitting, they had castrated one of the guards and shoved his testicles in his mouth. And when the press is there, and who's the press? The LA Times, the New York Times, the London Times, and the AP, and this is so significant because the AP stories go out everywhere, to every small town in Holland, Michigan, Iola, Kansas. Prisoners, barbaric prisoners, have killed these guards. And they said, and we've seen it with our own eyes, and we even have film of it. So this is the front page of the New York Times. The Gray Lady, the paper of record, that this reflects a barbarism wholly alien to civilized society. Prisoners slashed the throats of utterly helpless, unarmed guards whom they had held captive through round-the-clock negotiations in which the inmates held out for an increasingly revolutionary set of demands. This is the New York Times. This is the front page. This is the LA Times, and the same story, and as I just told you, this goes out everywhere. In fact, if you go into many upstate towns, but particularly Attica, today, and you ask who killed the hostages at Attica, you will hear the prisoners. So in this moment, this moment is a game changer, because until that moment, the idea that prisoner rights were civil rights was really becoming cemented in the national consciousness in a way that it never had been. But this moment is so upsetting and alarming for good reason to people that they start questioning the whole business of prisoner rights. Now, meanwhile, while the nation is not just turning against this, but the telegrams are flooding into prisons everywhere, lock them up longer, we need supermax prisons. They actually called them maxi facilities. The death penalty, we need the death penalty again. We need longer sentences. This kind of punitive ethos is awakened. But meanwhile, this is what's actually going on behind bars. And this becomes a key part of my book, because this is what was denied, literally denied, for decades by state officials. And that was outright torture. These guys are stripped, they are lined up, they are beaten mercilessly, they are forced to run gauntlets, they are crawling over broken glass. Remember, every window's been shot out. So there's glass everywhere. Rockefeller calls Nixon that morning, and Nixon congratulates him on an excellent job done. And he has only really one question, because it is a little alarming that so many hostages have died. He says, but was this a black business? And Rockefeller basically says, why, yes, Mr. President, it was. And you can quite clearly see from this Holocaust-like picture that it was not a black business solely, it was a human business. And the guy on the table in the upper right is the guy with the sunglasses I showed you at the negotiating table. That is Big Black. He is the one that was accused, or the reporters were told, had castrated a guard. The guard he allegedly had castrated was Mike Smith, the terrified guard I told you about. Mike Smith had not been castrated. Mike Smith had been shot in precision across the abdomen 4 times by a fellow corrections officer. I told you he was not that liked because he supported prisoner rights. This is also Big Black in the bottom picture. This is hours after he's been tortured. By tortured, he's had a football held under his neck for like 6 hours. He's told that if he drops it, they're going to shoot him in the head. He doesn't doubt it for a moment because he's watched these people be shot down one after another. There's a close-up of this picture where there's a tear you can just see coming out of his eye. He can't move. They burned him with shells. They broke both of his wrists, the picture you're seeing right there. He was beaten so severely in his genitals that he had lifelong damage from that. And that picture was taken just before a whole nother spate of torture happens up in Solitary. Now, by the way, this torture was denied. It was denied for years and years and years, and the American public didn't have a clue what was really going on inside of DR. Now, thankfully, because of lawyers and because of young law students and because of people who understood that they needed eyes on this, young law students and lawyers were beating down the doors of this place and trying their best to get these guys lawyers, to try to stop the reprisals, to try to at least make sure their Miranda rights were being read, trying to get court injunctions to stop the abuses inside that they didn't know for a fact were happening, but pretty well knew were happening, just given the tensions that had led to this. And we'll talk about those lawyers in just a minute because I'm wrapping up. Meanwhile, it isn't just, of course, prisoners who have died, it's also hostages. And while the prisoners are being tortured inside, the hostages are enduring their own nightmare. And what is their own nightmare? Their own nightmare is not only that they've lost their loved ones, but they are being told that their loved ones have been killed by prisoners, and yet they're not able to see the bodies. And, you know, Attica's a small town. It's tiny. And they knew the funeral director, you know, this Mr. Marley's funeral home. And, you know, Mrs. Cunningham, who's just lost her husband, she has 8 children. Like, she goes and she wants to see her husband. But he's terrified because there's all these troopers lining the walls of this funeral home. And basically they're trying to get the funeral directors to sign affidavits saying that the throats have been slashed of these hostages. And he brings her back in the room and he's terrified. And he just, you know, brings her back and he lifts up the sheet so that she can see that her husband's been shot. But he just goes like this, like, don't tell anybody. And in addition, within days, as these people are recovering in the hospital, the hostages that managed to survive, or trying to bury their loved ones, state officials are showing up at their houses with these small checks. Mrs. Cunningham, here's a little something to tide you over. Mrs. Cunningham has 8 kids. Her husband's just been killed. You know, she needs money for groceries, and she and all the widows needed money, and the ones recovering in the hospital needed money, and these checks were a pittance, $42, $120, and they never told them that if they cashed those checks, they would be electing a remedy under New York state law to not sue their employers for the deaths of their spouses and loved ones. And the book shows you that this was a deliberate strategy on the part of state officials. So they're being swindled, they're being lied to, the prisoners inside are being tortured. Now there are some heroes in here. There is a small town coroner who gets the bodies, and despite all of the troopers lining the room like this, he can see they've been shot. His name is John Edlund. He went public. He said every one of these people killed on the 13th were killed by law enforcement guns. And the governor said, well, you're a communist. Let's bring in a couple of other pathologists. In fact, they completely discredited him. He was haunted for the rest of his life, you know, just pulled over randomly all the time. I had access, the story of the research of this book is just this whole other story, but I got a lot of the letters that were sent to him during this time period from citizens. I mean, it's just horrific. He was just literally subjected to abuse for the rest of his life, a very short life, I might add. Of course, the other pathologists say, yeah, these guys have been killed. Yeah, they can see the bullets too. But by then it's too late because, of course, the narrative is the narrative, right? And it's very, very difficult to change the public narrative once it's been set. And so we get all of these telegrams, right? Lock them up. Longer. Prisoners are animals. They're not people, and so forth. Now, the book, the first third is the uprising. The middle third is about the legal story, which is incredible. Because there are a number of investigations that happen after this, a number of them. But they never get anywhere, really, because, of course, what the book will show you is that they couldn't really get anywhere because the records were being changed and hidden and burned and doctored and removed. So the Justice Department doesn't really get anywhere. The congressional hearing doesn't really get anywhere. There is a very valiant citizens effort to understand what had happened, the McKay Commission, and it does quite a bit, but it doesn't know who shot who, it doesn't know what happened because it doesn't have the story. Why doesn't it have the story? Because as the book shows you, in the days and literally the days and weeks and months after Attica, there was a cover-up, and historians do not use that term lightly. There was a series of secret meetings being held at Rockefeller's Peconico estate in the pool house, you can't make this up, between members of law enforcement and Rockefeller's team, where basically everyone's getting the story straight. What happened here? But meanwhile, trooper statements are getting altered. There's a whole second generation of statements, and stuff is being burned in fireplaces. And literally, the only investigation that has any legs is the investigation that Rockefeller calls for, the Attica investigation. But guess who the investigators are? The same state troopers that retook Attica, at least in the very critical beginning stage. So all the evidence that, might have been exculpatory towards the prisoners, it gets swept up, it's buried behind the prison within 48 hours. And the entire investigative effort, which is supposed to focus on the deaths at Attica, and it's supposed to include an inquiry into trooper wrongdoing as well, ends up completely focused on the prisoners and ends up indicting 62 prisoners on 42 felony counts. And this is important for history because what that meant was, so first you have Attica and you're told that the prisoners were the barbarians that killed the hostages. And then for the next 5 years, you're watching nothing but these black and brown prisoners being paraded in and out of courtrooms, particularly the Erie County Courthouse in Buffalo, but also in Warsaw, New York. And again, because of young lawyers and because of the legal profession and because of the National Lawyers Guild and because of legal aid and prisoner legal services, these guys all had lawyers, and only 2 people ended up ever being convicted, and even they later will be granted clemency by a subsequent governor. But the damage that this does for what Attica means is really irreparable. Now, that story, they take you in the trials, the criminal trials, it's an amazing, amazing, like cat and mouse game back and forth. As I always say, the prosecutors and the defense were handed a whole lot of garbage to sift through because, in fact, even the prosecutors, those folks trying to represent the state, were also kept in the dark about a lot of what was really going on. And so the whole last part of the book is about the prisoners and the guards themselves who just refuse to go away because they want this story told. This is Big Black, the one you saw on the table. And in one of the most extraordinary and longest running civil cases in state history, the Attica brothers finally were able to have trials, well, certainly a civil trial, civil rights trial, but were awarded extraordinary damages. And those were then overturned. And so ultimately, a judge by the name of Judge Michael Teleska in Rochester is really this incredible individual who says, we're going to settle this thing. These guys have a right to be heard. And in his courtroom, he allows everybody in DR to tell their story on the record. There is a settlement, and then the guards and their families also mobilize, but they can't sue, so they have to levy pressure on legislators in Albany, and they also get a settlement. Okay, I'm going to finish now because I know we probably have a lot of questions and comments, but why does any of this matter? And why does it matter when we sit here 47 years later? Well, it matters because somehow we have built a country where in my state of Michigan we have 400 children serving life sentences, and until a recent Supreme Court case, we're not even going to ever see the possibility of parole. Almost 400 in Pennsylvania. We have more people serving life sentences than at any other time in American history. We know that we have the death penalty again, and we know that prison conditions, particularly for the mentally ill and for our poorest and most vulnerable citizens, are horrific. It's not debatable. It's not a political statement to say it. It is factual. We recently had a riot, some of you may know, in South Carolina at the Lee facility that I've been covering pretty closely. I did a piece in the New York Times on it. Those guys are still on lockdown. Those guys literally have not been out of their cell since April, and the food shows up sometimes it doesn't, in these little freezing cold cardboard styrofoam containers, not nutritious, not remotely. People aren't getting medical care. There was a young lawyer trying to go down there and trying to represent these guys. We don't really have a mass legal aid effort like we did in the 60s anymore, in the 70s, but individuals are trying. She goes down there, she's trying to represent these guys. She meets with this one man who is I think he's either a paraplegic or quadriplegic, and he is so terrified to talk to her, like his eyes are darting around. He doesn't really want to talk to her because of the prison officials nearby. And she notices that he is literally he smells. He's in a disgusting state. And he quietly reveals to her they had not even given him Depends to change. You know, he was still in the same, attire and undergarments that he had on the day that this had all erupted. So when I say it's a crisis, it's a crisis. And so that is why it's really important to figure out how we got here. And in closing, did Attica get us here? No. We started the war on crime before Attica. We had made the decision in the wake of the rebellions of the 60s to do a much tighter job of law enforcement. And the 60s has everything to do with some of the political decisions that will happen afterwards in criminal justice. But the one thing that we've never really been able to explain is, where does the public anger come from? Where does the public fury at those behind bars come from? Where do we get so punitive? Where do we decide that if you do the crime, it's not just enough to do the time? Right? It's not just about being in behind bars. It's not just about being secluded. It's about actually anything goes to you. You know, anything's game once you're behind bars. And that's one of the things that Attica helps to explain, because everybody remembers that moment. They don't know why, but they know one thing, that Attica, man, that means the worst of the worst. Attica is ground zero for the ugly things that people do that land in prison. And in fact, Attica was about the ugly things that people do when they have power and nobody's watching. Thank you.
I'm seeing Lee Coppola, Mr. News reporter, taking all kinds of notes. So we're probably going to pick up right after. We'll take a quick break, and I'm talking quick break, 10 minutes or less, and then we've got some surprises, and we'll have a panel set up, of which we're going to have Heather join us together with Lee Coppola and Gary Loford, which will be incredible. So join us in 10 minutes or less. Thank you very much. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
Hey, can I have Gary and Gary Lee? We're going to take a picture here of the group. That was unbelievable.
Oh, okay.
We're going to take a picture. We'll get up here.
Well, thank you.